So thank you so much, and we'll move on to the next presentation. Okay, so next up we have presenters Florriann Fehr and Judy Duchscher, both associate professors with Thompson Rivers University, and their presentation is titled Out on My Own, Newly Graduated Nurses Moving into the Professional Workplace. I'll pass the virtual mic over your way. Let us know if you need any tech support. We have the lovely Judy in the background who's able to support if you need it.
Thanks, Kim. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm Judy Duchscher, and I just wanted to add that we've got, thankfully, a few presenters here today, and I'll ask maybe if all of them can turn their visuals on. Florriann Fehr, Tracy Hoot, Robin McDonald, and Andrea Burrows is here. I think Maddie Cook is also here, and so I just hoped that they might turn their cameras on so everyone can see them. Sorry, just doing some tech things here. Okay, so how wonderful that we're able to be here today with you, and we're going to share the presentation back and forth. I'm gonna start and then hand it pretty quickly over to Robin, and I'm going to share my slides right now, if you don't mind. Okay. Oopsie. Let me get. So I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement, and we, the presenters, acknowledge the traditional Secwepemc Nation and the unceded territory within the Secwepemcúlecw where we are guests. As settlers, we thank you for allowing us to learn, teach, and enjoy the wonders of your territories. And we acknowledge the presence of our Secwepemc ancestors who have and continue to care for the lands, waters, and animals. May they be proud witnesses of our ongoing journey of reconciliation. So we're going to talk, oopsie. You can see we have a very large team that was involved in this research. I'm just trying to get my little screen to disappear. There it goes, good. So I can see. As you can see, we had a very large team. It takes a village to do a large research project like this. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the research project, but for the most part, we wanted to focus more on the findings. So I'm going to hand it over actually to Robin, and Robin is going to introduce the team, and then she'll introduce our next speaker. Robin, did you want to take the reins?
Yeah, thank you, Judy. So my name's Robin McDonald, and I was blessed to be one of the research assistants on this project, along with Madison Cook and Julia Lowe. Madison was our lead research assistant, and she did a lot of work on the grants and making this project really come into fruition. So thank you, Maddie. And then, of course, Judy is the primary investigator on this project. We had a lot of help from Andrea Burrows at Interior Health, as well as many of our partners and collaborators from TRU. So I'll just list the names in order as they appear on the screen. So Renee Anderson, Florriann Fehr, who you'll get to meet today, Chelsea Holmes, Tracy Hoot, Noman Mirza, and Mateen Shika, Tracy Scott, and Michelle Seibel as well. So then next I'll just give a little bit of an overview as to what kind of led us to this research and why it is important. So for new graduate nurses, it can be very difficult for them to come into a practice environment after they graduate, especially today with the realities of the critical staffing levels that we're seeing in nursing. It's very difficult for nurses to find a balance between what they were taught in school as to what is the best practice or the most ideal way to conduct yourself as a nurse, whereas they'll get into practice and they'll realize that you can't always do things the way that you were taught, or maybe the culture on the workplace is different. So they might say, oh, we don't really do things like that here. And nurses kind of learn that practice is different than what they're taught. So it can be morally distressing to new nurses. There are some alarming statistics about new graduate nurse attrition. So 33 to 61% have been cited as changing their place of employment or leaving the profession altogether within their first 2 years of practice. This is a significant number, especially considering the extreme nursing shortage that we're facing today. 45.5% express uncertainty about their decision to remain in practice, and even 25% would not want their friend or someone they know to go into nursing, and they would actively discourage them from it. So with those alarming statistics, I'll pass it on to Florriann, and she will give you a bit more information on our project.
We'll just switch to the research approach, Judy, on the slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So I was so excited. I just kept sitting.
So I'll start with the intent of the research. And as you can hear from Robin, I mean, we really wanted to explore the new graduate nurse experience and find out, more in depth about the culture that's happening between the education and the workplace experience. And by doing this, we were going to examine the relationship with the experience of transition, and then also see if there's a correlation between a mentoring experience, which we formulated together, and transition shock, and just see what was happening there.
And so we also wanted to use this research to inform nursing and the healthcare community to better address and understand attrition, and looking at what is the optimal transition experience for the new grad when they enter into the workplace. And just going back to those stats that Robin shared, and looking at 45% of these new grads thinking of leaving the workplace, the effect that actually has on healthcare in the end. So it's really important to understand the research and the information so that we can better support these new grads when they enter into healthcare.
So as you can imagine, this was a huge collaborative undertaking, thanks to Judy and her leadership and coordination. It was a very mixed strategy approach. We combined qualitative and quantitative work and had a huge team behind the scenes giving their expertise, faculty, RAH leadership, and of course our senior nurses and our new nurse graduates as the participants. Judy had worked very hard in putting together mentors with new graduate nurses in the workplace, and she had some reflective engagement work, some interactive workshops, some simulations as well. And in that, data was collected qualitatively through interviews, through voice and visual and photo reflection, and there were some mentor and mentee partnership pairing exercises as well, all grounded in Judy's work related to the stages of transition and transition shock constructs, which is roles and relationships and responsibilities and knowledge, and looking at that together. And Judy will now share with you her amazing findings.
Sorry, I didn't mean to advance prematurely.
I just quickly segued in. No problem.
I don't want to go any further with that comment.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks Florriann and Tracy for that wonderful overview of our approach. We really wanted to focus on the findings because there's a lot to talk about here. As we all know, we're really experiencing quite honestly, a devastating, and it's really hard for me to wrap my head around what is going on in practice for nurses in general. And I do think that it's important to make that point, that whatever's happening for a new graduate is also happening for the seasoned practitioner. The seasoned practitioner is just a little bit more able, and not as much now because they are exhausted. They are experiencing a pandemic themselves personally as well as professionally. So I don't think the senior nurses are as available emotionally, or quite honestly, even physically, to support the new graduates in practice. And as we know, there's been an attrition rate of the seasoned practitioners, which impacts not only the knowledge broker position that they have in practice. These are the individuals with whom all of the experience and tacit knowledge rests. And if they leave, where do new graduates get that tacit knowledge other than making their share of mistakes and finding out that, oh, I guess that didn't work so well. Let's try something else. So that's not the best way for us to run our healthcare system. So the fact that we are struggling to keep those senior nurses is impacting a significant amount on the new graduate experience. So this study, in terms of situated where in COVID, it was just ending as COVID was starting. And that's important because the graduates that were in this study were not a part of that COVID experience. Having said that, it's really interesting to see the statistics that we showed you pre-COVID, which was what the statistics were, and to start to see what's coming out now related to new graduates. And certainly, I think you can expect that any new graduate will think about leaving the workplace, but that's because of transition. That's because anyone in transition is uncomfortable, they're uncertain, and sometimes that's a really, really difficult feeling to sustain over a period of time. So in my experience with new graduates, which has been over 2 decades now, I would suggest that that stat of new graduates intending to leave practice is a pretty common thing within the first stage of transition for sure. Then they start to kind of figure it out, and their intent to leave at about 8 months to 12 months has much more to do with the experience that they're having in practice, this disconnect, than it has to do with their transition into practice. So let's talk a little bit about the findings. I think overall, the findings indicated that the support network, particularly when you think about isolated and rural settings, is crucial for the new nursing graduate. And I need to qualify that by saying that we did not have new graduates in rural and remote settings. But my experience of working with graduates who go into rural and remote settings is going to feed some of what I say. Gradual and intentional workplace integration is really important, and it came to light. A few things came to light for me. This is my 10th study in this area, and I think I noticed some things that are changing, and that's where this whole shift in the transition experience and just the employment patterns of new graduates, I'll touch on that. So in terms of the support network, the mentor's knowledge of new graduate transition is imperative. And this is something that I don't think that we have identified. I haven't identified it in my research, and I haven't seen any research on this. And I think that's an important finding, that, just sort of saying, we want you to buddy with this new graduate and not provide that mentor with a knowledge of where that graduate might be is doing a disservice to both the mentor and the new graduate. So that's an important piece. And BC's doing a very good job of providing information in their passage to practice events, and then the follow-up with those. And the mentors are being given information about the stages of transition and transition shock and what it is. Now, transition shock, just for those of you who don't know what that is, it's usually within the first 2 to 8 weeks of practice. And it's, as Robin was identifying, it's this real disconnect between what the student has been taught to expect and what they actually receive once they move into practice. Now, having said that, I'm learning some interesting things about the practice area right now. And I would suggest, and Florriann could really speak to this, she asked if she could meet with me, and we're going to talk about this next week, about the experiences that our senior students are having in the practice area, and that's the safe experience for them. And it's not sounding very safe. It's sounding like they're quite concerned, quite agitated, in fact, about what they're seeing, the lack of staffing, the fact that they're being asked to take on responsibilities that even as a student, maybe they would think otherwise under different circumstances. So we have a real crisis going on, and I think it's not like it's new, right, you guys? Everybody on this call knows that this is not new information. But I think what is new is that we're reaching the end of our level of energy to manage it and cope with it. Our resources are significantly depleted, and I think that that is going to impact what happens moving forward. And I think like most, like most crises, right? You can manage for a while, and then all of a sudden everything just crashes because you tried to cope for so long. And then one little thing, well, it's not a little thing. The pandemic is not a little thing, but it has almost sort of thrown a weight into that scale and really tipped us over the edge in so many ways. I'm sure all of you could identify many ways. So knowing what's going to go on for the new graduate in transition and being able to support them in that transition is really important, particularly in that first 2 to 8 weeks when they are really clamoring to find their footing, which is normal for a new nurse. The social contacts have always been important for new nursing graduates, but that need to belong, that need to be accepted, that came through really strong in this study, as it has in most of the studies that I've done on this topic. I think now it's even more important. Now, when you think about the rural communities, they generally have a pretty tight relational dynamic going on, and that's a positive and kind of a challenge at the same time. But I do think that the importance of pulling those graduates into the community, if there's a rural and remote experience, would be wise of the health regions and the senior nurses. Structured meetings, and this is something that I think could be even easier in rural and remote areas, because there's just not that many people. And so when you're paired with a new nurse, there's an opportunity to really develop that relationship, and that relationship is incredibly important. That idea that this is a no judgment zone, that if I understand, and it's easier not to judge if you know that that's a normal experience for any new graduate at 3 months or 4 months or 6 months or 7 months. And you can start looking for and anticipating what might happen in that particular stage or phase, and give the new graduate preemptive support rather than we're trying to chase our tails with these situations. We don't need to, because we know a lot about transition. So that information is out there. And this study really knocked that one out of the park for me. It really made it evident to me that the mentors need to anticipate, and they need to know where that graduate might be, so that they can they can introduce that idea to the graduate. Here's a perfect example. In the first stage, there's a lot of concealing that goes on. So if you hit that off at the pass and you say to the graduate, lots of new grads feel like they, don't want to share how they're feeling because they feel inadequate and they feel like we're judging them and whatnot. Is that something that you've been feeling? Wow, like that's huge for a new graduate. You basically gave them permission to tell you that they're uncomfortable. Whereas if you don't do that, you can anticipate that they're probably just going to hide from you and hide that experience from you, because they want you to think they're amazing. They want you to think they're being very successful. And so if they reveal to you that they actually feel like they have no idea what they're doing and they're terrified every day to come into work, that what would you think of them if they said that? So this idea of relationships is really important. I've spoken of some of these things, but workplace integration really for me anyway, in this study, there were a few outliers in this particular study when it came to, we had 6 mentors and 8 new graduates and 8 mentors. And what I noticed was that there was quite a mix in the new graduates. I mean, it wasn't as homogeneous an experience as I've had it be in the past, which was really good because it brought a few things to light. And I guess the first thing it brought to light was their approach to their initial employment. Now, you'll get the classic graduates that are like, yeah, I'm going to work full time and going to get as much experience as I can and earn that money, and away we go. But in this group, there were several that actually avoided, and that's what I would actually say. That it wasn't apparent initially that they were actually actively avoiding work, but they were. And so they'd work a lot of nights, and they'd not work a lot. And you know, under the auspices of, I want to have a personal life and whatnot. But as things went forward, it's important to understand that new graduates actually need to work. They need to work to gain their confidence, to gain that experience. The longer they delay that entry into the difficult times, like days, for instance, when there's chaos and a full patient load, given, you know, the understanding that you don't want to load them immediately, but the longer they delay that experience of stress and anxiety, the harder it is for them to even go to work. But this pacing idea is definitely new in my world of this research. This is a different demographic. They don't want to work 24/7. They really do want to have a life. They want that balance. And so if we don't give them that balance, they'll take it themselves. And I think that that's what was in part happening, was that they were just saying, no, I don't want to work because I'm being asked to work too much. There was evidence that traumatic events early on really alarmed a couple of the graduates and actually caused them to sort of pull back. And that's not uncommon. And I talk to people about this. Be very careful how quickly you throw that graduate into these experiences, because if they have a bad experience, they will regress in their feelings of confidence and competence. So it's really wise to sort of really be careful about what you do and introduce them slowly. Workload challenges and overtime have basically been normalized. I mean, I don't remember, and Robin and Natty can speak more to this, about the last time they actually went into work when they were fully staffed. So what is that, right? I mean, we need to be very careful about what we normalize and what that means for practice standards and the ability to feel competent and comfortable for new nurses in the workplace. This next finding about previous placements isn't new to me because it's very important if a new graduate could be hired into the unit that they spent their senior practicum on, or even a third-year practicum. That's important. Acute care is a crazy place. It is a crazy, crazy place. And there's no getting around it. Like we even if we're fully staffed, acute care is so different than it was, 10 years ago. The high level of complexity, the lack of stability in the patients, so that nurses need to be able to adapt. They need to be able to be very flexible. And there's a concept that Patricia Ebright from the University of Indiana discovered in her research, and she called it stacking. And it's where the senior nurse, and we all know what that's like. We go in and we get report and we make this list of all the things we need to do for different people, and we've already prioritized it and whatnot. And then we walk in and everything's gone south, and we say, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna have to change this and change that. The new graduate has a really hard time doing that, just normally. But when you throw in there this really chaotic and complex environment that's literally changing multiple times in the process of a shift, that's very stressful. And chances are new graduates not probably going to make the best decisions in that situation. And gathering data on a patient's one thing, but processing and responding to it is another. So that's kind of where the cognitive capacity of a new graduate needs to be respected. And that is that, you know, they're not really fully functioning professionals when they come in. And finally, the shifts in the transition experience are, I learned in this particular study that it's more the experience, sort of the hours overall, rather than, and my my theory of the stages of transition, it is presented in a linear fashion because that's just, you know, how it works. But it doesn't always present that way, right? They go up, they go back, you know, you'll have an experience and you're feeling confident, and then you're back to kind of that stage one feeling if you go to a new unit or something like that. But what I learned was that the number of hours, as opposed to the, you know, the fact that you've been in this unit for 4 months or 6 months, the hours worked are important. And you can overwork a new graduate, and a new grad can overwork, as opposed to work the number of hours that allows them to get in there, get some practice experience, but have enough time for reflection. So this work-life balance is important to them. So working with that is a critical part of a senior nurse or educator and a manager. I talked about the day versus night shifts, and that also wasn't overly new in this particular situation, but it became a place to hide. And I don't think I noticed that before, that new graduates might want to actually hide in the night shift. Impact of coping strategies, for sure, that is always important. And I think right now, coping strategies are often learned from our senior colleagues. And if we don't have exposure to those colleagues, or their coping strategies, if their coping strategies aren't the best, which, you know, who's coping well these days, then that's what I'm being modeled. So that's a challenge. The new graduate level of energy is very predictive of coping. So they need stability, consistency, predictability, and familiarity. That allows them to be successful. And if they are successful, they continue to advance along the stages. If they are not successful, if something happens and they're not debriefed and they don't understand why it happened, they will completely internalize that, and it will cause them to regress. So the success is really important. Now, you guys all know that problem solving, conflict, and time management in this contemporary environment are all happening in really high levels of complexity and chaos. And it's hard sometimes even for a seasoned nurse to problem solve when there's, you know, a conflict with a family going on, or, you know, a colleague has to go home ill, or something happened and the workload changes. That's really difficult even for a senior nurse. You can imagine how challenging it is for a new graduate. And again, the final question, and there's a lot of educators on this team, is whether or not we are actually preparing them for the environment that they're entering. My last slide is about the rural health context considerations. And I guess I would say that we need to be aware that there is a much higher expectation in a rural context, and certainly in a remote context. I've nursed in both of those, that you are an independent, autonomous practitioner. And I think that you can't expect that of a new graduate. So mentors really need to be prepared to be either on call or available in some way. This idea of the work-life balance, I mentioned to you that I think rural communities have an advantage in the sense that, you know, they wrap their arms around their practitioners, but it's also difficult because it takes a while to get that trust level. And new graduates are going to be anxious about that. Likely harder for them to say no to shifts, no to responsibilities. And sometimes it's harder for mentor and mentee compatibility, because you just don't have as many options for mentors in the environment as you would in a large urban setting. And trust takes time. So in terms of the approach to stress, I do think that having several new graduates at any given time in a rural context would be helpful because they can relate to one another. And it is a unique experience in rural health contexts. And how do you find a way to embrace, how do you help the community embrace that new graduate? And how do you help them with problem solving and time management when they are expected, probably a lot earlier than others, to become independent? How do you navigate that with them? So those were the primary findings, and then sort of a contextualization of those findings. And I'll stop sharing at this point.
Thank you so much to Judy and the team for presenting with us today and for sharing this wonderful information and very insightful. And I could foresee, so I was a technician at Kelowna General Hospital for 10 years before I moved to the research department. And I could foresee this being transcendent, and because I see the fluidity between many different professions in the healthcare system. And so I'm hopeful that this research will lead to other research for other avenues for different positions within healthcare. And I know that we are over time, so I'm going to welcome any questions to the group to be either sent through the Feedloop platform. You can always use the chat box and we can follow up later, and I'm happy to facilitate connections as well. So if anyone would like to email research@interiorhealth.ca, I can connect you to Judy's group to continue on this conversation. Thank you so much.